I don't even remember. The hottest party in town. Daniel chapter 3, a story you have heard countless numbers of times. Anybody crawl right off the bat what Daniel chapter 3 is about? No, almost. We're not quite there yet. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and the fiery furnace. Daniel chapter 3. We're going to do this also a little different this morning in that we're going to read, as we go through the message this morning, the entire chapter. And we're going to look at the story of what's behind and what's in front of Daniel chapter 3. So if you've got your Bible, you're going to need it. Open it up, turn to chapter 3, get out your little pointing finger, and be ready to read along verse by verse as we go through this. Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 80 cubits and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. And he set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. You see, if you go back in the chapter before this, Nebuchadnezzar had a vision. He didn't understand what it was. And he saw a great statue. And the statue he did not understand. And Daniel came and talked to him about the statue, and he told him what it meant. He told him what it meant of the ages. He told him what it meant of the future kingdoms to come. And after that time of the vision, and Nebuchadnezzar got his answer about that vision, he said, I don't like this. I don't like where this is going. And as he came to, in his physical senses, he said, I will change this. I will change this image, and I will recreate this image to be what I think it needs to be. So he instructed his laborers to create this great image. The image itself was 90 feet tall. It was approximately 9 feet wide. It was built on the plain of Dura. And even today, archaeologists have found a great base that at one time probably housed this statue. They don't know absolutely for sure that this was the base, but the base itself that is still there is 20 feet high off the ground. It is 46 by 46 by 46 square. In other words, approximately 2,400 square feet, about the size of an average house. It's the perfect foundation for this 90-foot statue. We don't know exactly what the statue was. It was probably in the same type image that he saw in the earlier chapter. But it was 90 feet tall, and it was made with gold from top to bottom. Probably it was a wooden structure, and then it was covered with gold, as was the way most things were done in that day. Built of wood and then covered with gold. The reason for the gold is a number of reasons. First of all, the statue that he saw in the earlier vision, the head of that statue was made of gold. And at that time, the vision told Nebuchadnezzar that he is the head. He is the gold. He is at the head right now. But things will change. Nebuchadnezzar didn't want that, so he created this image, gold from top to bottom, to where the previous image was not gold from top to bottom, but it was made of other precious metals. Reading on in verse 2. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent together the princesses, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, and the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of that image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had made. So in other words, he called the whole nation. He called everybody. He put it out on social media. He put it out on Fox News. He put it out on CNN. He let the whole world know, we're going to dedicate this statue. And fellow citizens, you better be there. Did they come? Oh yes, it's estimated that at the dedication of this statue there may have been as many as 100,000 people on the first day of the dedication. He called the whole nation. He called it out in a decree. The princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image of Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now his decree and his command was this in verse 4. Then he herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people and nations and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. In some of my reading, I read that this band, this group, was probably as large as if you were to take every single high school band in this state and put them all together. It might have been even as large if you took all of the college university bands and put them together. There were hundreds and hundreds of musicians that came with all sorts of instruments to play around this hillside. If this foundation, if this base was the one that the archaeologist has found, there is a dome, a hill that's like a dome, and this foundation sits right up on the very top. And it's possible maybe that the orchestra was around the edge of the mountain, all the way around it, playing this music as this huge image was behind them and on top of the hill, reaching up as high as 90 feet. Have you ever heard music like that? Have you ever heard a band, a group like that? The music from it would be so loud, and the vibration from it would be so enormous that you could not help but think this must be something great. No one could put together something like this unless they were really sincere and they really meant what was happening, and there was really a need to worship this image. Nebuchadnezzar went after the emotional response of the people, and he got it. Do people have emotional responses? I saw on the news this week where they're getting in a knockdown drag out over toilet paper. Is that an emotional response? He caused this emotional response through the building of this great image of gold and through this huge orchestra band that he placed around the image. And he dealt with the emotions of the people of that nation. In verse 5 he says that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, and you know some of these instruments here, they don't even know what they were. They can guess, but they're not really sure exactly what all they were. The dulcimer and all kinds of music, fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And in verse 6, and if you don't, here's what's going to happen. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall be the same hour be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. An idea, again, and I don't know why my nose has just started running all of a sudden this morning, but it's not corona. Here's what they think about this furnace. There were other furnaces built like this, not to this scale, but most all of the furnaces in the time, around this Babylonian time, were built like this, even the little small ones that you would cook on. They look like a vase in that there was a round base, and it came up around like this, and then the smoke stack would go up. Now that's probably the same design that the fiery furnace was made. But in this furnace, you would go around the edges of it, and there would be little windows. And these windows may have bars in them. And then you would come around to the front of the furnace, and there would be a ramp that went up to the front of the furnace, and two large doors that would open. These doors would be where they would throw in the burning material, either the wood, the coal, the oil, whatever it was they were burning, that's where it would go in, and then the doors would close. And what the furnace would do is it would draft air through these windows around it, and the fire would burn, and then it would go up the smokestack. Now, Mr. Fireman, you got to have three things for fire. You got to have heat, you got to have fuel, and you got to have air. You put those three together, and you got fire. You take one of those away, and you can put the fire out. Remember that. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. So, we've got the image. We've got the fiery furnace. We've got the decree from Nebuchadnezzar about the worship. We've got the band is all set up, and here we go. They're fixing to strike out. In verse 7, therefore at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and the kinds of music, all the people in the nation and the languages, they fell down and they worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. In verse 8, wherefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. Now here's where we get into a political fight. You see, the ones that had been called in, it was all the nation and all the people, but he called in all the rulers and all the governments and all the sheriffs and everybody that had any kind of leadership ability at all. He called them, and the decree was to call them and to call those that were under them, so the whole nation would come. Well, these Chaldeans came, and they realized that, hey, there's three Jews that didn't come. Maybe some other Jews, but three in particular that were leaders, probably in a higher position than these Chaldeans were. And they thought to themselves, hey, these three's not coming. If they're not going to come, and we tell on Neb, and then he carries out his rule, which he always did. You did not go against the rule of Nebuchadnezzar. He'd have your head cut off. Let's tell Nebuchadnezzar about these three guys, and if they won't come and worship, then he won't have any choice but throw them in the furnace, and those positions will be open to us. Maybe. So these Chaldeans made this known to Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 9, they spake and said to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. He buttered them up. He buttered up the king. Let's first, before we tell him about this, let's butter him up real well. O king, live forever. Do you think, and we're going to get to them in just a minute, these Jewish boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do you think they knew what was going on? Do you think they had heard the decree from Nebuchadnezzar? They knew about it. They knew what was going on. And they knew, knowing Nebuchadnezzar as they knew him, more than likely they were going to get called out on this. What were they thinking? What was going through their mind? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They hear this decree and they say, yes, we're going to get called out on this. But these three Jewish boys, from what we know about them in the Scripture, I bet they knew these things. Thou shalt have no other God. Amen. Do not bow down. Amen. I am the living God. Amen. Create no graven images. I am that I am. Amen. And they probably knew a lot more, but I guarantee you they knew this. They knew this language. They had this understanding in their hearts. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not escape the fiery furnace when they got there. They escaped it before they ever got there. Because their mental attitude was correct. And it was right to the point of faith. So as we read on, let's look at verse 11. And whoso falleth not down and worship, that he should be cast into the midst of the fiery furnace. In verse 12. And there are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Wouldn't it be great if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego maybe would have been great? Would never have been called before Nebuchadnezzar? Would never have had to have faced the fiery furnace? Would never have had to face the Chaldeans who brought the charges against them to Nebuchadnezzar? They had to. They had to. These three guys, knowing it or not, were about to be used in the great plan of God at this time for this nation, for these people. Wouldn't it be great if we could all do away with our fiery furnaces? Well, folks, Amy, as you sang this morning, that ain't going to happen. Everybody in here, regardless of age, is going to find a fiery furnace. In fact, more than likely, you're going to find a number of fiery furnaces of different degrees of heat. There's going to be a bunch of them. You better get ready now. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were ready before they ever got to Nebuchadnezzar. And the proof of that will be in the following verses. And the truth of that for us is, if we wait to build our faith when we get to the fiery furnace, we're probably not going to go through it in the way that God would have us go through it. It will be a defeat. No Christian will be able to live in the world and not be discovered that he is a Christian if he is truly a Christian. Christians are the light of the world. You are not to put a bushel over your light. At some point in time, God will test you. He will test me. And as we've been learning in our Sunday night disciple time, James says, count it all blessing when these trials and tribulations come against you, that you might prove yourself worthy in faith to the point of producing fruit. In verse 13, what happened to old Nebuchadnezzar? Then Nebuchadnezzar in his, what's that word right there? Rage. It means violent anger. This is the only time this word is used in the Old Testament, in that language. The only time. It is a rage to the point that it is absolutely driving him, and he has no control over himself. What is controlling Nebuchadnezzar is all-out rage. Rage always brings about anger. And folks, I've learned this the hard way, and I'm still learning. This is one of my great downfalls and needs. I would confess that to you openly in a moment, that you might pray for me in this way. When I get angry, I lose all sense of reason. I go nuts. I say things and do things that I should not say and that I should not do, and that is truly not in my heart, but in that fit of rage and anger, it comes out. I had a man about 3 or 4 years ago. He said, we didn't know each other that well. I just met him on something, and he said, you look like the kind of guy that could really tear somebody up. And I think, gosh, I hope that's not my image. Easily angered. Well, this guy was angered to the point of losing all reasons. In verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, going to let them have a little out right here. He spake and said unto them, is it true? O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not ye serve my gods and worship the golden image which I have set up? This is the great question. Their great question. Do you not worship and service the gods? My gods? Now if you be ready, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, if you fall down and worship the image which I have made, well, but if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And here's Nebuchadnezzar's question. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? In other words, in Nebuchadnezzar's rage and in his anger and in who he thought he was, he said, "Who is a God that could possibly remove you from the circumstances that I'm about to put you in, which is a fiery furnace? I'm going to burn you boys to the point that they won't even recognize your bones." Evil will always deny divine essence. Nebuchadnezzar had become so evil and so wrapped up and so lustful within himself of who he was and his ego and his esteem that he denied that there was even any God that could stop what he was about to do. And he told those boys that. He said, "Who could possibly undo what is fixing to happen to you? Bow down and worship this image." Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter." Now, if you will notice, probably you've got careful in King James, and some of you with study Bibles or illustrated Bibles will see that that word is underlined. Some may even have a number about it. Let me give you a little bit better English word for careful. Read it in this way: "We are not afraid to answer thee in this matter." That word careful there, for us to better understand it, means I'm not afraid. I wasn't afraid before. I'm not afraid now that I'm here. And I'm not going to be afraid later. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had already met through faith this attitude of fear, and they had complete control over that attitude. We are not afraid. You ever been afraid? I don't even remember what year it was. I was a teenager, 18, 19 years old. We decided to go, we lived just outside of Little Rock, and we decided to go up to Lake Conway that night and put out some yo-yos. We got up there at dusky dark and we put the yo-yos out. Wasn't nothing going on. A friend of mine said, "Well, while we're waiting on these fish to bite, let's go up to Conway and go to the movie." Okay. Guess what we saw? The Exorcist. We didn't know. We come out of the movie. The moon was gone. It was dark. We went back to Lake Conway. That's a spooky lake at night when there's no moon, and all those poles sticking up and those trees, and different birds and creatures hollering, and yo-yos going off in the dark. We left. We left. I was shaking all over. I've been afraid a couple other times. Here's the thing about fear. Fear can get a hold of you physically. It can get a hold of you mentally. It can get a hold of you spiritually. The physical, the mental, and the spiritual being fearfulness has to do with the body, the soul, and the spirit. Our whole unit becomes afraid. From the heart to the soul, to the mind, to the spirit, we can become afraid. Nebuchadnezzar thought these boys they'd respond in that kind of fear if he was going to throw them in the fire. But they weren't. They stood there in all faith with no fear.
Yeah.
In verse 17. If it be so, do you get that? Now this is these boys responding. Hey, Nebuchadnezzar, if it be so, God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of thine hands. Basically what they're saying is, hey, if you throw us in the fiery furnace and it burns us up, if it parches us all the way down to where you can't recognize the bones, we won't be there. We'll be in heaven. Doesn't make any difference. And if you throw us in that furnace and the Lord decides to protect us and to deliver us from the flames, that'll be fine too. That test will come to many of you. As a personal testimony, it came to me not long ago. I went to the doctor to have just kind of a checkup, and they found a tumor. And that doctor told me when we woke up and told Miss Donna we needed to call the family together for prayer. It was large and it was cancerous. And I had to go to a specialist after that. It took a little while to get in, but I had some time to think in between that. Well, Lord, if this be it, so be it. If this is the way I'm going out, let her go. You know, it's kind of strange to think as we sat here, all of us are going to go. Every single one of us.
Yeah.
Some of us might die from a heart attack. Some of us might die from this flu thing that's going around. I don't know. Some of us might die from a cancer. Some of you might get hit by lightning. I don't know. But we're all going to go one way or another.
Man.
So be it. You're not going to change that time. I believe, you believe it's predestined by God. He knows exactly the day you're going out, and He knows exactly the way you're going out. So these three boys at the fiery furnace, they said, Lord, you know how we're going out, and if now's the day, let her go. And they told that to Nebuchadnezzar. And it made him even madder. He got even more angry. You know what's funny? There's two fires going on here. One of them, we know exactly where it's at. It's in that fiery furnace. You know where the other fire was? It was in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar. People who live without Christ have a fire in their minds that they cannot quench. This fire was eating at the heart and the soul of Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 18. But if not be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. In other words, they said, no. No. Verse 19. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his vengeance, so he got madder, was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was. Now, I don't know what they had to do, but buddy, they turned up the heat. They put more fuel, they put in more oxygen, they put in and built up more heat, and that furnace was roaring. In verse 20, and he commanded the Most High men that were in his army, the Most High men in his army, to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning, fiery furnace. Then they marched them up that ramp. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. He didn't bother to disrobe them or anything. He wrapped them up. He tied them up. He said, that's enough. I'm burning anything and everything that's part of you. Throw them in. Verse 22, therefore, because the king also commanded was urgent, and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They took them up the ramp, they opened these great doors to throw them in, and the fire came out of those doors and consumed the soldiers that had marched them up there. Now, I don't know for sure, but from what I've seen, maybe from what you've seen in certain fires, if you put so much fuel on that fire, and the heat is there and the fuel is there, but it can't get enough oxygen. When you open a door or open a window, it's called backdraft. Because that oxygen rushes in, it hits that heat, it hits that fuel, and it explodes in flame. I've seen houses blown to pieces as a result of backdraft. Anytime you come to a house fire and you see the smoke being sucked back into the house, up in the gables or around the eaves, that means there's more fuel in there, more heat in there, but there is a lack of oxygen. And the minute you open those doors and windows, you better be careful, because that fire's coming to your face. They went up, they had put 7 times more fuel on the fire. They opened the doors, possibly the oxygen rushed in, the fire came out the door, and it consumed every one of the men that carried the 3 boys up the ramp. And the 3 boys were consumed into the fire and fell into the pit. And oh my, what happened? Verse 23, and these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. They're in there. Then Nebuchadnezzar in verse 24, the king was astonished. And he rose up in haste, and he spake. And he said unto the counselors, did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they answered and said unto the king, true, O king. And he answered and said, lo, I see 4 men. Well, some will debate who the 4th man is, but there's no doubt in my mind it was Christ. It was Jesus Christ the Lord. He was in the furnace with them. Now, we don't know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego saw the Lord. It doesn't say that. It says that Nebuchadnezzar and the people looking in saw the 4th one. Point here. If you're in a fiery furnace, the way the Lord appears as an angel of help or sending His angel may not be exactly what you think it might be. Who knows what the grace of the Lord around us looks like? It might be something we don't even recognize that's come to minister to us in this state or in this condition. But one thing's for sure, the presence of the Lord was with these guys. And one thing's for sure, you will never, as a child of God, go through a trial or a test that God is not with you. Never. It cannot happen based on the laws of mercy. It cannot happen. Who was in that furnace? If you want to go to the Old Testament words, it was Adonai. Adonai, the Lord, was in that furnace with them. In verse 26, then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning of the fiery furnace, and he spake, and he said to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth from the midst of the fire. Let me go ahead and read on. And the princes and the governors and the captains and the kings and the counselors being gathered together saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed upon them. Folks, you can't hardly escape the smell of fire. Anytime you get in a fire, anything and everything that's in that fire, the people who go in that fire, firemen, coats, helmets, boots, things, you cannot get away from the smell. But these guys come out and there wasn't even a smell on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake, and he said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel. And a little better word right there is messenger. The messenger that he sent was Christ. And delivered the servants that trusted him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Nebuchadnezzar's changing his mind a little bit. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut into pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. I bet the Chaldeans didn't like that. But here's the point, guys. Here's the closing point. You think old Nebuchadnezzar would have been saved after this, right? He made this decree, serve their God. I command that you serve their God. He wasn't. He wasn't saved. He was still full of himself. He was still full of pride. He was still full of arrogance. He still said, I am Nebuchadnezzar. I'm the king. I decree that you go serve the God of these three boys. It's not until over into the next couple of chapters that he eventually does get saved. But you know what God's got to do to get Nebuchadnezzar saved? He's got to change his mind. He's got to get rid of the anger. And here's what he's got to get out of him. Number one, he's got to get the pride out of Nebuchadnezzar. He's got to get the pride out of Nebuchadnezzar. No one is saved without losing their pride. No one is saved without losing their pride. And this guy hadn't lost his pride yet. I decree that you serve this God. Well, later on, you know what God did? He said, fella, you're going to live like an animal. In fact, how many times did he want to heat that fire up? 7 times more? There were 7 seasons that came upon Nebuchadnezzar as he was an animal, that he ate like an animal. He ate grass like an animal. His hair grew like an animal. It says it grew to the length of, I think, feathers or eagle's feathers or something. His fingernails grew out long. His toenails grew out long. He grunted like a goat. He lived like an animal for these seasons of time until God allowed one little glimpse of a vision of His grace to come into his mind, and Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm broke. I'm broken. I'm humiliated. I have no more pride. You are the God of gods. Amen. He found the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because they went through the fiery furnace. Who are you going to lead to God because you went through a fiery furnace? As you sang in your song, Amy, every day is not perfect. Every day is trials, tribulations, furnaces. And it's hard and it's difficult. And so much of the time we do not understand the miracle of the furnace was that those boys did not get burned up. The miracle of your trials and my trials and your tribulations and my tribulations is that God can take them and point someone else to Jesus Christ. So bring it on. Bring it on. If I die today, so be it. But Lord calls me not to be afraid. If you would stand with me, bow your heads. Amy, I'm going to ask you to come to sing that.